From theCUBE studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from theCUBE and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Enterprises are rapidly moving from an AI that answers questions and generates content to one that performs tasks and actually takes action. According to Thomas Kurian, CEO of Google Cloud, this shift requires a fundamentally different approach to infrastructure and software. Google's view is that only a tightly integrated portfolio, which spans from silicon all the way through to applications and services, and everything in between, can effectively support this transition. Now, a linchpin of this transition is the emergent data and AI platform, what we call the system of intelligence, what Google is initially exposing as a knowledge catalog. Now, this capability ultimately abstracts and harmonizes analytics and operational applications. In addition, we see an evolving, what we call a system of agency and Google calls a system of action, which comprises a knowledge catalog, their terminology, and their agent platform. Now, we think that measurable business value is going to ride on top of this infrastructure, and that's where the real battle lines are going to be drawn. And specifically, we see frontier model vendors, of which Google, of course, is one, rapidly building out capabilities that will become fundamental to the future of software, which we think will be the biggest transformation in the history of the software industry. And in this breaking analysis, we're going to contextualize the announcements and news from Google Cloud Next 2026 using the framework that we've been iterating for the last 3 years, and joining me is the architect of that framework, George Gilbert. George, good to see you, thanks for coming on.
Good to see you.
Okay, so let's start with, the big news, of course, on Tuesday night, they had the guys from the Acquired podcast.
Yeah.
Hosting the announcement of TPU 8T and 8i, so obviously that's a big news. This is their 8th generation. They were saying it's not an ASIC. I'm like, well, if it's not an ASIC, what is it? Well, it's a general purpose chip, although they're specialized. I think it is still kind of an ASIC, but nonetheless, that's the big news to kick off the show. Google positioning itself as the only hyperscaler with a frontier model, and then of course, the whole data stack that we're going to talk about. So, number of highlights at this show, but you've been here, you've been talking to a number of people. Let's kick it off with kind of a riff on some of the things you saw, and let's set up the conversation that we're going to have today.
So the big setup is Google has been doing yeoman's work with their data platform for a number of years. They are the only hyperscaler that was really competitive with Snowflake and Databricks, with not just BigQuery, but the metadata that they put on top of it, the integration with the operational database spanner. But this was all leading up to this birth of a new layer. Because for 60 years we built silos. We built analytic data silos, we built operational application silos. But if you want an agent that's going to transform your business, that's able to perceive, to reason, to decide, to act, and then to learn, it can't do it in silos. It doesn't unlock any value if it does that. Then you're just doing automation, but you're not changing how your business works. So that gets us to the layer that really has to change, which we're going to
so the premise that Thomas Kurian put forward this week was we've moved from RAG-based chatbots, request and receive an answer, and now we're moving into a world where agents and multiple agents are acting on behalf of humans and taking action. We say taking agency, and the premise is that requires an entirely new infrastructure. It has to be integrated. They truly are the only full stack hyperscaler.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair commentary. And if you look at the frontier model vendors, they don't have a cloud. And so Google has some advantage there. But Andrew, if you bring up the first slide, one of the things that George and I have been talking about on Breaking Analysis, and he's been digging into in his research, is this idea of service as software. We didn't coin the term, I think Phil Hirsch coined the term, but he uses services as software. But the whole point being that when we shifted from the on-prem to the SaaS model, everything changed. The technology model, the business model, the operational model. We see the same thing happening here, and this slide sort of lays that out. This is sort of an advanced version, thanks to the help that we now have of tools like Nano Banana, versus you spent hours doing this before, and so and I'm sure you still spend a lot of time, but basically this stack, this is very similar to what you showed before, a little bit more elegant and with some cool things, but let's walk through this, and that key piece in the middle, that SOI, what they're basically, Google is talking about as a knowledge catalog, and we'll dig into that.
All right, but I want to make one distinction. When you said we moved applications into the cloud, that was, everything had to be re-architected. We needed a new operating model for the software. We needed a new business model for the vendors offering it, not just the pricing model, but everything about their organization in terms of delivering that value. Now, on a monthly basis, and keeping it up, they're responsible for the operation and delivery of that software. But it changed only the software companies. What we're talking about—
and IT, right?
Yes.
Yeah, inside of a large organization. What you're talking about now is it's changing the entire organization, not just technology companies, any company. And you've made this point that when you scale, any company now can scale with less labor, and marginal software economic-like dynamics
they become platform companies.
Right, they become platform companies, and it's you've said it becomes a winner-take-most or a winner-take-all market. So how does it relate to this slide that you're showing here?
So the catalyst, I mean, we've been moving in this direction, but the catalysts are agents. And as we were saying, the agents don't really unlock much value if you put them in silos, because then all you're doing is automating small tasks. Where they add a lot of value is when they change entire business outcomes. And a business outcome like let's say Salesforce uses the example Indeed, which is I think a hiring firm.
Yeah, it's like a recruiting,
recruiting firm. So you'll take a KPI and you'll say, I want the entire onboarding or the entire onboarding process for a candidate to hire to be changed. And so to do that, just as a context, that means you have to remove all those silos that are in this slide at the very bottom layer. The data platform, where even your analytic data is in silos, and your real-time system of truth, your operational applications, you need a new layer on top of that. What we're going to show now, which we haven't shown before, is a migration path for how people are going to start getting there.
And I think when you think about this idea of silos, it's created departments. Each department has its own data, its own database, or its own data warehouse, or its own data mart, whatever it is.
And its own applications.
And it's all these applications, right. And we're talking about the entire company being able to point its value proposition as services, through software. And that's a completely different dynamic. So let's go on to the next slide, Andrew, which is the 5 stages of data platform maturity. This is, I think, a 9 step process here, where we're going, from the world, which now is the non-deterministic world, and we're blending that with the deterministic world on the new slide. But let's talk about this. We're talking about the sort of the emerging data platform, which becomes the substrate for what you just described, and you're taking us from different levels here. The silo that you just laid out, to this notion of it's going to completely change the organizational structure. Take us through this.
Okay, so back when I used to go to the eye doctor, and he'd put a spoon over one of my eyes and asked me to read the letters.
You would fail.
Yeah. So apologies for the eye chart.
Great colors, though. Thank you, thank you, Nano Banana.
But okay, but the idea is as you move from left to right. Left was when you ran your reports against the operational siloed apps themselves. Level 2 was when you had a data platform, like a Snowflake or a Databricks, and you standardized your metrics and dimensions, so that you had these cubes that were fed by different applications, but still essentially each department had their own cube.
And on level 1 there was no self-service. Level 2 there was a little bit self-service.
Right. Now, Level 3, without going into all the details, you're modeling more of the business. Now you're getting real-time events from the operational applications so that you're enriching what you've modeled in the data platform. So you're getting, the events get enriched and the entities in your data platform get enriched, they enrich each other. Level 4 and 5, now you're getting into like what the Salesforce Data Cloud or an SAP Data Cloud is, where they've modeled the processes from their applications and you're getting rich behavioral patterns and even predictions about those behaviors. And you could think of those as an overlay on today's data platforms. They're not going to be walled gardens, but they're going to be value add layers. So that gets us to the stage where we're ready to layer the system of intelligence on top of this.
Okay, and I think it's important to point out that the North Star here is a digital twin of the enterprise.
Yes.
So a real-time digital representation of the enterprise that captures people, places, things, and activities,
yes.
processes. And Andrew, if you go to the next slide, it's the next 4 levels here, the 4 stages of system of intelligence. Now we bring in the deterministic layers, because what we're doing is we're bringing the non-deterministic and the deterministic together so that agents can take action confidently. So
right.
You've got all this creativity with tokens and LLMs and generative AI, but it's got to be grounded in determinism. So take us through this.
So think of this as agents have goals and guardrails. The guardrails are the things that they must do, the actions with the rules that they must follow. And so, without going through the details of all the layers, at the leftmost, you're saying how, let's say in a bank, how a bond issuer relates to all the bonds that they've issued, and that relates to the investors who bought the bonds. That's the level 1, that's the level 6 knowledge graph. As you move to the next layer, you're actually modeling the actions that can be taken. So these guardrails get richer. Then at level 8, now, these are still, though, referring back to the underlying systems, so this is an overlay. 6 and 7, you're overlaying your analytic data estate and your operational ops. At level 8, now this is the source of truth. And that's when you start to unplug the legacy systems. And then level 9, you actually store even the workflow logic as data. And so the whole thing can learn and be optimized on its own.
So I hope you don't mind me mentioning this. So this is work that you've been doing, I think Jeffrey Moore, when you first laid out this concept of service as software in more detail than some of the other superficial things we've seen out there. His feedback to you was you got to help organizations take the step, show them how to get from point A to point B and all the steps in between, and for months now, you've been digging into what those steps are, and the 2 slides that we just showed you are really the thinking that has gone into that.
Those are the deterministic layers, and I thought I was done in January, and then we got to, let's go to the next slide.
Yeah, then bring up the next slide if you would, Andrew. The full stack digital twin, architecting the expertise refinery. So take us through this. You're using terms like scaffolding. You've got the orange or yellow and brown here, the blue up top. Those are the sort of two different, the
yellow, gold.
The stack of the 2 that you just sort of took us through, the deterministic and the cognitive piece.
So those bottom 2 layers, the rules and the mapping, that was the slide we just did.
Yep.
And that's when I thought I was done. And then there was all this chatter about the context graph that went viral in the VC and vendor communities starting, I think, in December, January. And that's all the tacit knowledge, which is, what do you do when the rules break down or when there's conflicts in the rules?
People call it tribal knowledge sometimes, right? And so, okay, and so you and I talked about this, that the agents will, at that point, there's an exception, it goes to humans, they're in the loop, the agents will learn from the reasoning traces of the humans, and then that's the reinforcement learning.
Yes, and there's a way of, there's a whole set of layers for how do you capture that, and different approaches. But most of the approaches out there, and we're not going to go into all the approaches here, but the gold standard, the one that the frontier models, the frontier labs use, is from a company called Mercor, where you teach, an expert teaches their thinking process and a way of grading the reasoning process and even showing the wrong reasoning. So without going into all the details.
But a simple, like a really simplistic example is if the agent comes up with 1 + 1 = 3, you penalize that agent and say, no, that's wrong, 1 + 1, and try it again, 1 + 1 = 2. Ah, you're right, you reward that like Pavlov's dogs.
Right.
And that means they get better and better. And then as that occurs, scaling laws will kick in, and that's where you get the flywheel.
The compounding. Now, the key point that you're getting at is, you can only cover so much of how your company works in the deterministic rules, which is what I thought I was finished in January. But there's 90% is all the tacit knowledge. And so the reason we're getting into this is because it's going to bear relevance to how Google is approaching this, and how they're moving into this realm. The reason I'm using this Mercor gold standard is, the only way you can capture the why behind the human expert's reasoning process is if the human teaches that and teaches you how to grade the reasoning process. All the other methodologies are trying to do it on the cheap because it's less onerous on the human expert. But if you put these two layers together, you can do it much more efficiently. In other words, if you do the deterministic rules, it makes it much easier to capture the tacit knowledge.
Got it. And I was in the analyst session all this week, and we had a number of sort of breakout sessions on this. I was in one was very much a deep dive of sort of the agentic platform and the steps that Google is taking and how they're making this all happen. And it was quite good. There was a lot of really intelligent analysts that are into this space, asking a lot of good questions. And so while it's still early days, we're starting to see some maturity. So Andrew, if you could bring up the next slide. What we've done so far is we've largely talked in terms of the framework that George has built. Now what we want to do is map Google's parlance and their announcements on data and AI into our world of system of intelligence. Again, Google is using the system of intelligence, George, as sort of the modern legacy, the modern data stack, not equipped to handle what they call the system of action, what we're calling the system of agency. Our parlance is different. We see the system of intelligence as a crucial harmonization layer that feeds the system of agency. And so let's walk through the mapping of Google's terminology and our terminology.
All right, so there are two broad categories there are two product lines that they have, the knowledge catalog and the agent platform. We're going to strip those, for the most part, those names out and talk about the features and plug them into our layers. So let's go through one by one. So at the very bottom of our 5-layer system, we had the mapping layer. That's when you put the system of intelligence over all your legacy systems, you have to map. You have to map to what's down there. So customer across all different systems, you have to figure out what that means. Now, so they have in their knowledge catalog that they extract the DBMS technical and lineage metadata. They do something actually that's now pretty advanced in that they take unstructured or document-oriented, the tacit knowledge, they pull that into a knowledge graph. What they don't yet do is unify entities across systems, so there's not one way to resolve the customer reference across all the different systems.
They extract the entities, but they don't unify them.
Yeah. Okay, so that's layer one.
Okay, you've often, I just want to point out to the audience, you may have heard us talk about, George sort of educated me on this, is database, they store things in strings.
Yes.
The knowledge graph speaks in things that people understand.
Yes. Yeah. And what we want to do is get from strings to things to activities with the processes, and that's really hard.
And we often use Palantir as an example. It came up today in one of the breakout sessions. They weren't poo-pooing Palantir, they were just saying that and I think rightly, that they can cover a lot more ground. Palantir does what it does at a very narrow pace, but it's a harbinger of things to come. But let's go back to the
perfect example.
Yeah, let's go back to the slide and take us through these layers.
So this is when I say activities, that's the business processes, or the business process rules that are entangled and entombed in all the legacy application silos. That's that layer 2 rules layer. Right now, what the knowledge catalog captures is data quality rules, the BI metrics. This is called dimensional semantics, not yet full application semantics. So it's like metrics and dimensions, and a business glossary. But it's, again, it's getting to the Palantir quality, application business process rules. That's the next step, and then that's a hard step. That's hard.
Yeah, right. I mean, Yasmin said to me the other day, we realized that several years ago you couldn't just plug an LLM into a database and expect to get, kind of tons of value out of it.
You don't say.
Yeah, you don't say, right. I mean, you go back 2 years ago and everybody was excited about that. I know we were excited when we built our first RAG-based database, and it's like, okay, now what? And then you get to the point where we get agents that are, taking action.
And it's ironic that they said that they figured that out 2 years ago, because I think Microsoft figured it out 2 years ago, and they were working with LLMs that's just far back as, if not farther back than Google.
Well, and they probably were, had some advanced research going on in this, and then it hit the product teams a couple years ago. So who knows? We'll see.
Well, this is Fabric IQ, which was they sort of pre-announced it,
Right, and the entire world started to realize the value is
in that layer.
Right.
Okay. Right. So now the third layer. This is up in the tacit knowledge. The 3 layers in the tacit knowledge. Here's institutional memory. This is what we were saying. The gold standard is expert reasoning traces. How does an expert think about this problem? What so far Google has is the storage substrate to capture the agent reasoning, which is very different. So they have something called a unified trace viewer, which gives you all the agent reasoning paths, which is how an agent got to an outcome, but not the human expert reasoning, which gives you the why. Mm-hmm. So it's the first step.
It's nuanced, but yeah, it's a first step, and it leads to level 4.
Okay, and so level 4, now if you had the why, and then you had a whole library of why, then the agent can ask, in this situation, what do the system of intelligence, recommend? Mm-hmm. And give me a confidence score. But without the why, you still have a bunch of reasoning traces. It's institutional memory, but it's more at the strings level, frankly, than the things and activities level. And so...
So it lacks, perhaps, the judgment that a human would.
Yes.
And that's a hard thing to replicate.
Yes, yes, this is why it's a journey. So at level 4, they have the infrastructure for decision guidance, and they synthesize, essentially, they're synthesizing things like, what are they called, data products, and maybe the knowledge graph, components of the knowledge graph. So they're synthesizing context and then letting the agent essentially retrieve that and make a judgment on its own. But what you really want is the system of intelligence to offer more confident guidance to the agent. So we're not there yet.
Okay, so that takes us through the left side, the system of intelligence, and now what we call the system of agency. So the system of intelligence is essentially our parlance, but these are the features. I like the way you laid that out.
So just to be fair, that some of these things, like level 1, level 2 was in their knowledge catalog, level 3 was in their agent platform, and level 4 was back in the knowledge catalog. But just to simplify it to our mapping.
Yes, right. That's important to point out, that their system comprises the knowledge catalog, the agent platform, and obviously other tooling. Yeah.
So then the system of agency, this is the top layer in our system, which is everything everywhere. Everything everywhere has to have a learning loop.
Everything everywhere all at once.
Yeah.
Right, everything has to have a learning loop, and that loop is...
And so what you want, ideally, is, sorry about this, I put this on
well, that's the way it works sometimes. Yeah.
I put it on sleep. So what you want is the agent to perform its work and get a score from the system. How was your reasoning? How did it compare with the objective metric?
And then you reinforce that over time,
right.
And then that's when you can start to scale this confidently.
Right, and then it starts to compound. Now they have two, that's ideally, they have two features to call out. The agent evaluation is multi-turn scoring, so this is like an agent that has interacted with tools, users, sort of think of it like a deep research pattern. They can evaluate the entire chain, reasoning chain. So it's not just the request response. So that's an important step. And very interesting is the agent optimizer, where it can look then now at a cluster, say, of failures of the agent reasoning, and say, this is how you should refine the agent. That's Databricks had that last year, and that was very impressive. So finally, and we'll get more into this, how this extends into an enterprise agent platform on the next slide.
Okay, and I want to just sort of take a pause here, and I was talking to a number of customers this week, asking them, because TK in his keynote said we're beyond the pilot stage, we're into sort of the deployment, and it's true for some customers, but when you really push them, it's still early for them. But when you ask them, okay, where are you? What are you doing with the productivity gains, and how are your people spending time? And what it was very clear in talking to a number of customers, they're having their skilled employees pivot to actually to building these agents, deploying these agents, going through this process. It strikes me, George, that the forward deployed engineers of Palantir were actually doing this for their customers and have applied this and went through some kind of similar process, maybe not identical, but the ontology.
Yes, the ontology was that layer 2 rules layer,
yes.
and they built up over 20 years the layer 1 mapping layer. So they had the deterministic foundation. I'm not 100% sure how far along they are on the cognitive tacit knowledge layer.
Okay, so let's move on. So earlier this week, I think it was actually yesterday, we heard that Elon has an option now to buy Cursor, which was quite interesting. So you've got Anthropic, obviously Claude Code is, doing great. OpenAI, with Codex.
Yeah.
Google takes a different approach that we'll talk about, and Grok, XAI, has to have a coding agent. It's got to have that capability, or it's not going to be competitive as a frontier model. And so some of the investors were sort of griping that, well, geez, we thought we were investing in XAI, and now he's got to go buy this other thing. Well, if he doesn't buy the other thing, they're going to fall far behind. So Andrew, if you bring up the next slide, let's take a look at Anthropic, who's been doing very well, as we know, in the enterprise, and compare its roadmap to Google's agent platform.
Okay, so the story here, to key off what you were talking about with coding agents, is Anthropic's leaned into coding first. And I don't know if they knew it when they started, but to build a universal knowledge work agent, you have to start with the coding agent, because the way you interact with the rest of the world is through code. Like, it was sort of one of those man bites dog moments, where just to call a tool, originally you just invoke a tool API, but it turns out actually now to invoke a tool, and a tool is anything you're going to interact with, whether it's a word processor or workflow, you actually write code to call the tool. And so you're starting with a coding agent and a coding harness. And so it turned out that Anthropic turned out to be the best positioned to go after this universal knowledge work agent. Now, the reason that, now this is a bit of an eye chart and it's kind of hard to go through everything, but the main point that I want to make is that there's a progression here where you start out with the Anthropic's harness was leaked, some of the stuff they hadn't developed yet. Then there was this Conway project where it's their attempt to build an entire sort of platform for sort of knowledge work, not just coding, but you would have applications in it, proprietary extensions to MCP.
So it's, yeah, so it's their in-house, their proprietary piece built on top of MCP.
Yes, yes.
MCP is open source, and but then they're going to add value on top of it and keep it to themselves.
And proprietary memory, proprietary observability. But the point I want to make is where Google goes beyond is that, and this is, there's going to be competition where the frontier labs are going to try and carve off. Amazon has Bedrock, Azure has Foundry, and Google has now Agent Platform, which was built on extending Vertex and rebranding it.
Right.
But there are some things that Google has that the frontier labs can't really offer, or not there yet, which is first.
This is irrespective of the fact that they got cloud, they've got silicon. You're not talking about that. You're talking about some capabilities.
Even in this, turning the harness into a platform. And I guess what I should say, what I'm trying to say is that like the Anthropic platform may carve out part of the Google agent platform and fit in it, but there are things that Google's going to provide that Anthropic, using this as an example, can't really. One is, like they give its governance. So
they being Google.
Yeah, Google. Yep. For we've always given the agent the identity of the user, but an agent needs its own identity because it's going to go do things not just on behalf of the user, but it's going to do things on its own, and so we need like a new security model.
And potentially on behalf of other agents.
Yes, so we need a new security model, and so this is, our security model in the past was tied to like resources, like, even tag, like you can't get this data or you can't get personally identifiable information, that's still there. But there's a new layer where it's intent-based. Like given this context, you can do something of this intent, and that Google announced, and it's a merging of the data and control plane. It's very advanced, and so Anthropic and anyone else is going to need to plug into that. That's just one example. Another one is memory, where you don't want, if any enterprise lets its memory get trapped by one vendor in their proprietary stack, they are raising their switching costs, and they're creating more silos. Because you want that memory to ultimately to be part of that harmonized semantic layer that we've been talking about as the system of intelligence.
Okay, so you're saying that memory has to be accessible and shared?
It has to be shared and governed and harmonized. Now there might be personal preferences and things like that can be local, but like procedural memory, like how to do stuff, that needs to be harmonized and shared and governed, and because otherwise, how are other agents and other people going to coordinate if your stuff is locked inside your agent? So those are two examples, and then just the big trend is the tools and actions that you can call, and the data that your memory that becomes your data. This is the data and action space. When it unifies, it becomes a semantically harmonized knowledge graph. That is the unification of your data and action space.
And that leads to the digital twin,
yes,
the digital representation of the enterprise. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. All right, so I guess at this point I would say, make an observation that we developed, John Furrier and I, the Gen AI power law early on in Gen AI. We projected to be all these small language models and specific languages. Yes, they could be these big LLMs, but all this other stuff is going to, and of course it is. That turned out to be true. But what was somewhat of a blind spot was that the degree to which the frontier models would become more and more and more capable. And I think increasingly we're going to see that, and David Floyer has written about this as well, is they are going to be a critical piece of all these SaaS applications are going to partner up, and you're already seeing that. Google's announced a number of partnerships. They tout a number of partnerships with companies like ServiceNow, like Workday and others. And so that LLM becomes crucial and increasingly sophisticated and powerful. But let's bring up the next slide and wrap on some of the final thoughts. We've got 2 more slides here. I mean, Google betting the farm on the integrated stack. Their premise is that you can't succeed in, or I shouldn't say you can't succeed, but the success that they're driving with their customers is largely going to be a function of that integrated stack. That's their differentiation. We come at this oftentimes through a data lens and a data platform lens. We have a note here of, well, what does this mean for Snowflake and Databricks? And those are probably, we oftentimes lump them together.
Yeah.
But Snowflake solved this problem in 2012 very elegantly, and very simply. Databricks took a different approach. Maybe has, I liken it to Amazon's primitives. Jassy saying, well, we choose this more complicated path because it gives us flexibility in the market, versus the integrated approach maybe makes it more difficult for you to pivot.
So in the case of Databricks and Snowflake, and in the next, I don't know, month and a half, we'll see what their latest has to offer, but they're coming from essentially the read path. Give me context from the data platform, but they're moving up from the data platform, to have richer context. But then the question is, once they read that, how will they operationalize that decision that their agent makes? And is their agent as strong enough? Is it strong enough, having started like the others with a coding agent, to take action?
And in our Crossing the Rubicon post, we pointed that out, that to the extent that they go in that direction, now they start to tread on new territory. And we say that in point number 2 here. And Google has this similar challenge, but Google has so much more of the stack. But it's certainly moving in the right direction. But now you're moving into the areas of Palantir and Celonis.
And so even MuleSoft from Salesforce.
Salesforce for sure. ServiceNow has designs on that. And so I think as an LLM frontier vendor, Google has some advantages, and they can partner with those companies and create a win-win. That again leads to wither SaaS. I mean, the frontier model players, as you say, are going to partner with the SaaS companies. The question is Gemini going to be the preferred option for OEMing to those SaaS companies, or is it going to be an OpenAI, or Anthropic is right now, looks like it's in the driver's seat, but things change so quickly here. Any thoughts on that?
The only thought I would offer is, what happens, someone really wants to talk to me, my sister-in-law. What happens when a SaaS OEM is running not on the Google Cloud? Their data has to leave their security perimeter if they're going to use Gemini, because Gemini only runs in Google. This is like when Microsoft first tried to use Anthropic and GitHub Copilot, they had to send the data over to Amazon. So that's
well, they did announce the cross-cloud capability. You saw that, but Gemini doesn't extend to that.
Right. So that's just that's an issue to consider. The other is they have to put that harmonization layer, what we call the system of intelligence, across the SaaS apps.
Right. Okay, and then point number 4 here, explain this. You harness must first be based on coding functionality. Of course, that's what we're talking about, and the reason why Elon is making a bid for Cursor. And you look at how Anthropic approaches it, and OpenAI, they've got kind of, let's dig into this. So Anthropic and OpenAI have this separate thing, right? Claude Code, Codex. Google's sort of approach is to sort of embed its coding throughout its stack.
You're highlighting something important, because they bought Windsurf, and they renamed it Anti-Gravity. But I don't think that harness has been fully integrated into the agent platform.
No, but it's not. I guess my point is, I think it will be, but my point is, it's not like this separate thing that it's just there embedded throughout. I think it's their philosophy.
It needs to be. I don't think it is yet.
No, but I think that's their architectural approach, is to do that. The other point you'd made, not here on the slide, but is that OpenAI maybe has a a challenge because they were built for the cloud. So you accessing through APIs versus Anthropic is like running on a developer's laptop.
Yeah, that was a huge original difference between the two.
Yeah. Okay, number 5 is a really important point. Amazon won the day with startups and tech-centric organizations because people realized, well, I could just do this in the cloud. I can, not have to keep building data centers, and so the best and the brightest migrated. All the startups, all the early startups went to AWS, and that created an innovation flywheel.
Yeah.
A similar thing is happening here in the ecosystem with Google. Is the AI, native AI companies, the ones that want to be best at AI, they are navigating or migrating toward Google, and that's going to be a big advantage for Google.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's like the new era.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And of course, Amazon's going to fight for its fair share. Microsoft's ubiquitous, so they can just they're just everywhere, so they can, pace that. The last point is really an interesting one that you sort of brought to my attention, that Google actually has, we say TPU capacity, accelerated compute capacity. So if you look at, actually bring up the next chart, if you look at Google's H100 equivalent capacity, this is a chart from Epic AI, I guess it's kind of a novel research company. Google has more H100 equivalents than any other cloud. This was amazing, and a lot of that, of course, is Google TPU. I mean, maybe it's a brute force approach, but they kind of control their own destiny in that regard.
But not only that, there was this concept that the guys on the Latent Space podcast, which is kind of the ground zero for AI engineers, came up with the GPU rich and the GPU poor. Yeah. Google is the GPU richest, which is why you see Gen AI and agents across their entire product line, and Microsoft is, they didn't really put it in Bing. That was just to get Google to, try and mess with search and reduce search profitability.
Troll.
But they bet,
I mean, the other way around.
Troll Sundar. Yeah. But then Microsoft had so little GPU capacity, they prioritized Office first, and they've been struggling with that. And that's why Azure doesn't have a lot of Gen AI functionality in the Azure services. I'm not talking about OpenAI as an API. I'm talking about what we've seen everywhere here, which is where you Gen AI enable all your services. That's why, because they're GPU poor.
So this is really interesting. I mean, to the extent that it's accurate, I have no reason to believe that it's not. But there's this narrative out there that there's all this competition to NVIDIA and it's going to erode its moat. That's not the story. That pink is largely serving, it's serving ads, it's serving, AI search.
Yeah.
And this is why Google, Alphabet as a stock, has held up very well, because they're getting clear ROI from their investments in CapEx.
Right.
Whereas you saw with Microsoft the divergence of CapEx spend and Azure growth. Amazon sort of got taken down. They're all kind of coming back now because I think people are realizing these companies aren't stupid. But it's really interesting to see the green. You've got Microsoft, because of OpenAI, has really a lot of GPUs from NVIDIA. And you look at Amazon and you look at their purple relative to Google's pink. So that's a potential challenge for Amazon in this race, and of course Meta trying to catch up.
And you know why with Amazon? Because like with GPUs, Jensen is selling the whole bundle.
Yeah.
Like not just the GPU, not just the pod, but now with Vera Rubin, you have to buy the CPU, the GPU, the networking, everything. You have to buy this, essentially the whole data center.
And he makes that point a lot. I mean, he's got the scale up. Obviously, Google's got scale up. Jensen talks about scale out and scale across. I think what he's doing is at a different level than what Google's doing, but they're the closest, I would say. They've got the relationship with Broadcom. I just don't want people to confuse all this with, this is a world of, there's so much demand for accelerated computing that anybody who can come up with a quality accelerator, ASIC, GPU, they're going to fill that demand. They're going to sell that because NVIDIA can't meet all the demand. Google's going to largely use TPUs for its own benefit. It's not going to like they're going to go out as a merchant silicon vendor. That would make no sense. But I think they've shown that on a 12-month cadence, which is what NVIDIA's cadence is, even though I would say that NVIDIA's performance and specs and performance per watt are going to continue to be the leader, but I feel as though that Google is separating from Amazon, from Trainium. Trainium is essentially, Inferentia is now being consolidated into Trainium. It's largely an inference chip, and so I know it does some training as well, but they're sort of consolidating those two platforms. I think two things. One is NVIDIA is going to have the volume. CUDA is going to be the dominant a programming environment, development environment, and there's going to be plenty of room for these other players to the extent that they can get the tape out and build quality, accelerators.
But the implications at the software layer was that Google's immense capacity allowed them to put agents everywhere across their product line.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, and it's a great place to close on. George, great work as always. Really appreciate it, and thanks for all the great work and coming on so late.
All right.
All right, and thank you for watching this Breaking Analysis. Thanks to the crew for supporting us here, and we will see you next time on Breaking Analysis.